Film and cinema was something that was created around the turn of the century, and at first it was viewed kind of as a cool thing to watch if you had the opportunity, but it wasn't really viewed as a game changer at the time. But that quickly changed. Films began evolving very fast, faster than most people expected. In 1927, the first talkie, a film in which people actually talked as opposed to the silent films that came before, was released, was called The Jazz Singer. And it was clear that the audience immediately wanted more of this. But as soon as the first talkies were released, films began having things to say. They started criticizing certain aspects of society and even pushing for change. And of course it would, because film is an art, and all art has something that it's trying to say. However, the government was growing increasingly fearful of this, and they basically thought that the film industry was getting out of control, which in a free society shouldn't really be any of the government's business to regulate that, but whatever. And due to issues with, the First Amendment, it was very hard for the government to pass legislation to regulate film. So, to deal with the film industry, which they saw as a growing problem, and to make sure that films didn't get out of line or push for change too much, they essentially gave Hollywood an ultimatum. Either you strictly regulate yourselves, or the government will step in and will do it for you, which no one wanted. So the film industry gave in. By the early 1930s, the Motion Picture Association of America was created the Motion Picture Production Code, or the Hays Code for short. Pretty much what that meant was film would need to get the stamp of approval from the Motion Picture Association, which most theaters would require. And in order to get that stamp of approval, they had to obey these strict codes and regulations, and pretty much just agree not to get too out of line. This was a major blow to the film industry because it limited how controversial their films could be. They couldn't even show a married couple in the same bed on TV anymore, yet alone make real, major societal critiques as all art is supposed to. However, gradually, films began to push the limits of the Hays Code more and more, and you began to see more kind of violent and sexually explicit things that filmmakers were kind of testing the waters with, to say the least. And this took a long time, and it wasn't easy, but then 1967 came out. In 1967, in my opinion, was the most important year in film history. Both Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate came out this year. One had violence unseen like anything else in a film that was approved under the Hays Code, and one was sexually explicit in a way that was previously not seen by a film approved by the Hays Code. But both these films got approved because people wanted to see them. And from there, this was the final 1-2 death punch of the Hays Code. There was no going back from here. Filmmakers were finally free to make the films that they wanted to, and they could really speak truth to power without having to be fearful of censorship. And eventually the Hays Code was replaced with the rating system, which is much better. It took decades for the film industry to truly become free, and now I'm very fearful that we're backsliding. I know that once you go down the path where you decide it's okay to censor art, there's really no going back. At least not for a very long time and after a very difficult struggle. Last year, the Oscars announced a list of diversity requirements that films needed to comply by to be nominated. On the surface, this might look good. Who doesn't like diversity, right? Well, that's not really the issue. I believe that Hollywood should be very diverse, but I don't believe that it should happen at gunpoint. These are forced regulations that are attempting to make films fit into kind of the accepted norms of Hollywood and society, and not really push the boundaries and make valid and sometimes controversial societal critiques like they should. Any regulation of the film industry is bound to make filmmakers wary of anything too controversial or outside of the norms, which, again, this is mind-blowing because this is what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to push these boundaries. I also know from the long history of film censorship, both in the US and abroad, that once you begin regulating the film industry and these regulations become more accepted, it almost always gets worse from there. If you can censor or deny a nomination to a film because the demographics of that given film don't meet the accepted norms, then you can do the same thing when the themes of that movie or the message of that movie also don't meet the accepted norms. That's a scary thought, and what scares me even more is how we've seen a major shift in exactly who's calling for these regulations to be put in place. Back in the day, it was the government who was putting pressure on the film industry to create the Hays Code. Now it seems like ordinary people on social media are demanding these regulations be put in place. So, it was the people who helped end the Hays Code by supporting controversial films like The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde. And now it's ordinary people who are bringing on this new era of film censorship. This is the one thing I'm an absolutist on. There should not be any film censorship under any circumstances, really. We need to reverse this trend now. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.